Thank you very much for including me in this important panel discussion on our new Cold War against China and its implications on the rights and welfare of Chinese Americans. Let me first talk briefly about America's new Cold War against China, when and how it began in recent years, and why both China and the United States, and for that matter, the world, can ill afford to let it turn into a military confrontation, like a hot war. And then I will talk only very briefly for the remaining minutes how the new Cold War against China affect Chinese Americans, because other speakers after me will have more to say about it. So let's begin with the new Cold War against China. Most Americans are familiar with the old Cold War, which occurred during the second half of the 20th century between two camps, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, popularly known as the two sides of the Iron Curtain. And of course, the Eastern Bloc was led by the former Soviet Union and the Western Bloc by the United States, both possessing mutually assured destruction by nuclear weapons. And that's why they were able to avoid a nuclear holocaust. China was viewed during that time as in the West as an ally of the Soviet Union in the 1950s, even though there were mounting ideological disputes and occasional border scrimmages between them, resulting in fact in the split, the Sino-Soviet split in early 1960s. It was called the Cold War because there was no direct confrontation in between the United States and USSR. Instead, there were plenty of ideological and political conflict or war of propaganda between capitalism and communism and between democracy and authoritarians. These all have implications for what we're going to talk about the new Cold War. As we all know, the old Cold War ended in 1989, 1990. President George Bush, promised a new world order and peace dividend. Political scientist Francis Fukuyama declared victory for liberal capitalist democracy and the end of history. What followed was, of course, the spectacular breakup of the Soviet Union into several new countries in Eastern Europe and steady expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, provoking, of course, suspicion and alarm in Russia, and worse, mounting tension between Russia and the United States, a subject, of course, not within the purview of today's discussion. While all eyes were on Europe, a new development of great geopolitical significance was taking place in East Asia. I'm referring to the concurrent and rapid ascendancy of China as a global economic power after the old Cold War, and the relative decline of the United States as an economic and political power. The source, really, that is really the source of the new Cold War against China. The new Cold War is rooted, unfortunately, in false assumptions and unrealistic expectations held by the United States, and our willingness and our unwillingness to accept China as China's inevitable rise and to treat China as our equal with respect that it justly deserves. To put it in another way, we are so used to being the number one, the big brother, the most powerful country in the world since the end of World War II, that we simply cannot accept China. China's rise, the new kid on the block, Donald Trump's campaign to make America great again is in fact the perfect example of our need to be on top of the world, and the head honcho, the dominant military, economic, and political power of the world. What, of course, is galling to us is the speed of China's economic rise and how China and the United States are mutually and economically dependent on each other. There are many ways of measuring the rise and decline of a country. By far, of course, the most common measurement, but not necessarily the most accurate measuring yardstick, is, of course, the annual GDP, the gross domestic product of a country. China's GDP grew about 27-fold in the first 20 years after the Cold War. After the Cold War. Surpassing first, the number 4 United Kingdom in 2008, and then number 3 Germany, and number 2 Japan in 2009. China is now running neck to neck with the number 1 United States, a position we occupy since the end of World War II. Some economists even think China has already surpassed the United States, especially in the, after the devastating economic blow due to this year's coronavirus pandemic. However, if we were to measure the standard and quality of living, the military power, the technological advancement, the financial assets, China is easily decades behind the United States. What is important to keep in mind is the fact that China managed to grow rapidly without invading, conquering, colonizing, and exploiting any country, and without establishing hundreds of intimidating military bases throughout the world, like the United States have been doing. At home, even more impressive is China's success in reducing illiteracy from 85% in 1990 to 0 today, creating the world's largest middle class and lifting some 800 million people from abject poverty in unprecedented speed and magnitude the world had ever seen. It is now on track to reach its national goal of eliminating poverty altogether within the next few years. In short, among the third world countries, especially those countries in Africa and Latin America, China has become metaphorically the city on the hill and the inspiration and hope for the underdeveloped countries throughout the world. To me, the realization that China was going to overtake us cannot be tolerated by us. This is what irks the United States. It is the fear of losing our number 1 position in the world. The flip side of China's rise, unfortunately, is been equated, therefore, with the fear and threat of China. We suddenly came to the realization sometime during the second term of President Obama, with Hillary Clinton as the Secretary of State. The fear is based not just on our ignorance of China, but also our false assumptions that a strong China would do exactly the same thing we have been doing throughout our history. And that is, China would seek expansion, conquest, domination, exploitation, and appropriation of what justly belong to others. Therefore, we must immediately take decisive steps to stop and reverse the rise of China. Hence, we have the new and still not quite fully formulated policy toward China, we then call pivot to Asia, or in other words, really what we're talking about is a new Cold War against China. Now, foreign policies, as Sheila mentioned earlier, have very significant domestic consequences, especially in domestic race relations. And then also, domestic race relations oftentimes shape our foreign policy. So where there is, sometimes tensions, like in the 19th century, tension between the white and the Chinese American immigrants, it influenced our policy for China. And that's how, what Sheila mentioned earlier, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Law got passed. In fact, that one is only one of the 15 Chinese exclusion law enacted against the Chinese to deny their citizenship, deny their participation, deny them job, and then force them to live in the Chinatown ghetto, nothing beyond the Chinatown ghetto. So that's a kind of, very antagonistic racial hostility toward Chinese, but with consequences also of our foreign policy for China. And the new China, the new Cold War against China actually is already showing signs of the revival of these anti-Chinese sentiment. Actually, if we look back to the history of Chinese in America, we knew exactly how to treat, for instance, Native Americans. We simply appropriated their land, occupied them, and then commit genocide against them. And then what's left of them, we put them in these godforsaken deserts in the Southwest of the United States. We also knew how to treat African Americans because we brought them from Africa in chain, and we kept them in chain for hundreds of years. And in spite of the Civil War and emancipation, the Jim Crow law replacing that and kept them completely under subservient role in our society. And only after 100 years, after the so-called Reconstruction, after the Civil War, that we have the new civil rights movement. And very many important civil rights laws were passed to achieve equality and opportunity for African American and other minorities. So we knew how to treat African Americans. We knew how to treat Native Americans. But the Chinese presented a new problem because Chinese were not indigenous people like the Indians were, and Chinese were not brought into the United States as slaves. And so the only way that we can do it was to come up with the whole idea of exclusion. That's why exclusion actually defines the experience of Chinese in the United States. And you had all these exclusion laws, and then from immigration, the Trump's Muslim ban was really an old policy taken out of the Chinese exclusion law. And so Chinese Americans now suddenly became an enemy, especially during the old Cold War, during the period of McCarthyism. Chinese were declared enemy number one, even though Chinese Americans had nothing to do with our hostility, our conflict with the Soviet Union and China being seen as part of it. But because we saw China being part of that, we got into a Korean War and we got into very violent and costly Vietnam War. Why? Because we consider China to be expansionist and attempting to take over Southeast Asia when in fact it was just a figment of our imagination. Now the same thing is happening now under the new Cold War. We think that the Chinese spies everywhere. In fact, being Chinese Americans is synonymous with theft, espionage, and treason. And this is why there is so much widespread persecution, discrimination, and prosecution, especially among Chinese American scientists and engineers. So let me just stop here and let the other people take over, especially to talk about the new McCarthyism.